December 2000, Wichita, Kansas. What began as a quiet winter evening would soon spiral into one of the most horrifying crime sprees in modern American history. 2 brothers, 5 innocent lives, a single brutal trail of violence that shook an entire nation. Welcome to Old Casebook, where we revisit the forgotten and the infamous, the strange and the chilling, all through the lens of the past. In today's case, we journey deep into the twisted minds of the Carr brothers and uncover how justice, though delayed, finally arrived. This is not a tale for the faint of heart. If given the chance, and unfortunately, that chance came sooner rather than later, the two ended up traveling to Wichita, Kansas with the intention of doing something neither had ever done before. One cold night, not long after their arrival, a young man named Andrew Schreiber found himself in the wrong place at the worst possible time. It was winter in Kansas. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and most people had chosen to stay warm and safe in their homes. But not everyone was so lucky. Andrew was intercepted at gunpoint while returning to his vehicle after a stop at a convenience store. His captors forced him to drive to several ATMs, withdrawing money for them before taking him to a remote area, shooting holes in one of his tires, and leaving him there. What makes this incident particularly interesting is that while many consider it the beginning of the Carr brothers' violent spree, only Reginald was ever convicted of the crime. Jonathan was found not guilty, and whoever Reginald's accomplice was that night remains unidentified to this day. Just 3 days after the attack on Andrew, Reginald and Jonathan were driving through Wichita neighborhoods when they came across a woman sitting in her car, parked in her driveway. Some reports claim the brothers followed her home intentionally. Regardless, to them, she seemed like an easy target. Linda Ann Walenta, a 55-year-old cellist and librarian, was no match for 2 armed men. One of the brothers approached her car and pretended to need help. When Ann rolled down her window, his expression suddenly changed. He raised a gun to her face. Startled, she instinctively tried to drive off, but her engine sputtered and stalled. As she rushed to escape, one of the brothers fired 3 shots into her. 1 bullet severed her spine. In a final act of survival, Ann managed to hit the horn, alerting a neighbor who called police. The Carr brothers fled before officers arrived. At the hospital, Ann gave a basic description of her attackers and their vehicle, enough to suggest a link to Andrew's case. Sadly, her injuries proved fatal, and Ann died shortly after. Whether the brothers meant to rob her or simply wanted to kill remains unclear. But what is clear is that their crimes brought them a disturbing sense of satisfaction. And no one could have predicted how much darker their fantasies would become. Despite escalating their violence, the Carr brothers weren't finished. They were ready to strike again. And what came next was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. If you're sensitive to graphic content, this is your last chance to stop watching, because this is where things get truly dark. On Thursday, December 14th, 2000, a woman, referred to only as Holly G for her protection, spent the night at her boyfriend's house. Her boyfriend, Jason B. Fort, was a science teacher and coach, living with roommates, 27-year-old financial analyst Bradley Haka and 29-year-old seminary student Aaron Sander. The 3 men lived together peacefully and often spent evenings with their girlfriends. But that night, something evil was about to enter their home. On the evening that would soon become infamous, Holly arrived at Jason's apartment with her pet schnauzer, Nikki, around 8:30 p.m. Jason wasn't home yet, so his roommates let her in while she waited. Settling into Jason's room, Holly passed the time watching television and grading papers, routine for a teacher like herself. Not long after, Aaron's former girlfriend, Heather Muller, a church preschool teacher, also arrived. As the evening wore on, Heather eventually fell asleep in Aaron's bed upstairs, while Aaron slept on the couch downstairs, and Bradley, another roommate, took a room in the basement. When Jason finally returned, he locked up the apartment and joined Holly in bed. The household slowly drifted into the quiet stillness of night, unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. Just after 11 p.m., the front porch light flicked on. Still awake, Jason and Holly froze, straining to understand what had triggered it. Soon, muffled voices turned into raised shouting, and then the nightmare began. A stranger forced his way into their room, yanking the covers off the bed, revealing the terrified couple. Moments later, a second man entered, dragging in a stunned Aaron and demanding to know who else was in the house. Both men were armed. Under duress, the group revealed that Bradley was in the basement and Heather in another room. The intruders, Reginald and Jonathan Carr, rounded up all 5 residents and herded them into Jason's room. Once assembled, they were ordered to strip and surrender their money. The brothers threatened to shoot Holly's barking dog, but it soon became clear money wasn't their goal. For over an hour, the Carr brothers subjected the victims to a series of horrific assaults, forcing them in and out of the closet, making them perform sexual acts on one another at gunpoint. Holly was repeatedly violated. Aaron, a divinity student, resisted but was eventually beaten into compliance. When they finished with Holly, they turned to Heather. Then came the ATM runs, Reginald taking each victim in Jason's truck to withdraw as much cash as possible, ultimately stealing about $2,000. In Reginald's absence, Jonathan took control, again assaulting both women. When Holly returned from her ATM trip, Reginald attacked her too. At one point, he leaned in close and whispered a chilling sentence. "Relax, I'm not going to kill you yet." As the brothers ransacked the home, they found an engagement ring hidden in a coffee can, or possibly a popcorn box, under Jason's bed. "Whose is this?" they demanded. Jason weakly raised his hand and, looking at Holly with pain in his voice, said, "That's for you. I was going to ask you to marry me." It was how Holly discovered he had planned to propose on Christmas Eve. But that moment was stolen. Around 3 a.m., the Carrs marched all 5 victims into the snowy night, loading them into 2 vehicles. They drove to a deserted soccer field and ordered the group to kneel. The chilling realization swept over them. "Oh my God, they're going to shoot us," Holly whispered. One by one, Reginald and Jonathan shot their victims execution style, leaving them to bleed out in the snow. The silence of the field was broken only by the desperate pleas of the young friends, pleas that went unanswered. Holly was the last. After the final bullet was fired, the Carr brothers kicked her limp body so it fell face down into the snow beside the others. Then, in a final act of brutality, they ran over each of the victims with a truck before speeding off into the night. The scene was absolutely horrific, and yet, despite the sheer violence of their actions, the Carr brothers had almost pulled off the perfect crime. Almost. Because what happened next is nothing short of unbelievable. That night, a real miracle took place. After the attackers fled, a disoriented Holly realized she was still alive. She had been shot in the back of the head, but the bullet hadn't killed her. Somehow she had the presence of mind to play dead until she was sure they weren't coming back. And as impossible as her survival seems, it came down to something as simple as a hair accessory. The bullet had struck a plastic barrette she wore in her hair, deflecting the shot that should have been fatal. It's surreal to imagine her putting that clip on earlier, not knowing it would end up saving her life. But Holly wasn't safe yet. She checked on her friends, rolling her boyfriend Jason over, only to find blood leaking from one of his eyes. In desperation, she took off the only piece of clothing she had left, her sweater, and tied it around his head to try to stop the bleeding. Her bravery and clarity under such trauma are astounding, but it's heart-wrenching to imagine the fear and sorrow she must have felt in those moments, surrounded by friends who were either dead or dying. And though she was injured, freezing, and completely alone, she knew she had to get help. Barefoot, naked, and with a skull wound, Holly summoned the strength to flee. In the freezing 17.6-degree weather, she ran more than a mile through snow, across a field, a construction site, past a pond, and through thick brush, until she spotted a house glowing with white Christmas lights in the distance. Crawling over fences, some lined with barbed wire, she constantly ducked into the snow, terrified that any passing car might be the Carr brothers returning to finish what they started. Finally, she reached the house and banged on the door, pleading for help. A shocked couple answered, and despite the horror of seeing a bloodied naked woman at 2 a.m., they wrapped her in a blanket and called the police. Fearing she might die before help arrived, Holly hurriedly recounted the entire nightmare to them and then again to the 911 dispatcher. When the police arrived, she was still alive. She was taken to the hospital, where she survived despite a fractured skull and frostbitten feet. Tragically, her friends and even her dog were not so fortunate. After murdering the group, the Carr brothers returned to the house and beat Holly's dog to death with a golf club, an act so senseless and cruel it's hard to even process. What happened next, though, is particularly striking. When officers arrived at the crime scene, one of them noticed something strange: a car slowly driving by. It was 4 a.m. in a quiet residential area buried in snow, so any traffic was suspicious. But then the officer spotted a detail that would become incredibly important. The driver stared straight ahead the entire time as he passed by, not once acknowledging the obvious crime scene surrounded by police tape. Then, strangely, the vehicle turned around and headed back the same way it had come. It was so suspicious that an officer took down the license plate number and asked a sergeant to pull the car over and identify the driver. When the man behind the wheel handed over his ID, it turned out to be Reginald himself. But at that point, officers didn't yet realize their suspect was sitting right in front of them. With no solid evidence, they let him go. From what I've gathered, the police were only on the lookout for Jason's stolen truck at that moment, so the white Plymouth Reginald was driving didn't raise alarms. What's more shocking, he was actually en route to swap cars with Jonathan. Little did he know, he had just narrowly escaped capture. Later that morning, Reginald arrived at his girlfriend's apartment, and that's when things began to unravel. A neighbor watching the news was horrified to spot the very truck connected to a quadruple homicide parked outside, right next to his own car. He watched someone carry a large TV from the truck into the apartment and immediately drove to the nearest police station to report what he had seen. When officers arrived at the complex, they were disgusted to find bedding and clothes belonging to the victims strewn around the area. As police knocked on Reginald's door, he made a move toward a side balcony like he was about to jump. But by then it was too late. He was surrounded. Meanwhile, Jonathan had his own rude awakening. He was staying with a friend who, upon seeing the news, realized he was wearing the exact clothes the suspect had on, and that one of the vehicles described by police was parked right outside. Reginald's girlfriend had already mentioned the white Plymouth to police. At first, I couldn't believe Jonathan didn't even change clothes, but then it hit me. He assumed there were no witnesses, so why bother? He cautiously asked his friend how she knew all this, and was stunned to learn that one of the victims had survived. Eventually, the police were called, and after a short foot chase, Jonathan was caught too. And here's one of the most chilling parts. After his arrest, while riding in the patrol car, Jonathan actually asked what capital murder meant, how the death penalty worked, and if lethal injection caused pain. Creepy, especially considering how little empathy he had shown for the victims just hours earlier. Eventually, both Carr brothers were tied to several crimes in the Wichita area and were each charged with more than 40 counts, including murder. The jury returned separate guilty verdicts. As mentioned earlier, both were convicted in connection with the Ann Walenta shooting and the quadruple murders, though Jonathan was acquitted of all charges related to the carjacking of Andrew Schreiber. In the end, both were sentenced to death, though their final fate has remained uncertain as legal battles over the death penalty continue. On a somewhat brighter note, it's believed that Holly and Andrew Schreiber, two survivors of the nightmare, found comfort in each other and eventually married. The Wichita Massacre is a horrifying story, one that leaves you questioning how and why the Carr brothers carried out such senseless violence. A former FBI agent said it best: "We can't find a motivation other than evil, and maybe for some people that's all it takes." The Carr brothers now sit on death row, their crimes forever etched into the darkest chapters of Kansas history. Justice may have come, but the scars they left behind still linger. Thank you for watching this episode of Old Casebook. If you found this story compelling, do consider subscribing to the channel and press the bell icon so you never miss another haunting journey into the past. Until next time, stay curious and stay cautious.